Supernatural, the CW's longest-running television program, has more than earned its label as a cult classic TV show. Having just finished its 15-year run, the later seasons may have trailed off drastically in both quality and audience, but no one can deny the sway it once held, or the dedication of the audience that stayed. Supernatural never attracted huge viewership numbers, but fans were both devout and vocal. Many of the fan-favorite minor characters made a living off con appearances alone in its heyday. It had huge support on fandom websites like Tumblr, LiveJournal, and Archive of Our Own, and it was one of the big three fandoms on these sites, alongside Doctor Who and BBC Sherlock. Millions of fans, mostly young and many female, were watching, talking about, gifting, drawing, making videos, and of course, writing fanfiction. Merch was sold, tattoos were inked, and characters were shipped for a good number of years. But 15 years is a long run for any show. Most shows, even the good ones, start dying off around the 3 or 4 season mark. And while that season held its own, the quality of the writing began slipping. In retrospect, season 5 was the start of a very, very slow death as Supernatural began slipping out of the fandom consciousness and into irrelevance. But not before making a surprising comeback, because on the 5th of November 2020, 2 episodes from the last Supernatural episode ever, and on the first day of the 2020 election at the height of vote counting, Supernatural began trending on Twitter for the most bizarre of reasons. One scene brought Supernatural back into the cultural limelight for a brief, final moment in the sun, right when America and the world should have had their unwavering attention fixed on the US elections.
When Jack was dying, I made a deal to save him.
You what?
The price was my life. When I experienced a moment of true happiness, the empty would be summoned and it would take me forever. Because the one thing I want, it's something I know I can't have.
Why does this sound like a goodbye?
Because it is. I love you.
Yes.
Goodbye, Dean.
Yes, this confession of gay love pierced through the veil of the US election news coverage, allowing people to make, well, copious memes conflating Supernatural with both the US election and rumors that Putin was resigning. And now that the final episode has ended, I think I can say without a doubt that this scene, and the mess resulting from it, firmly cements Supernatural into history as one of the worst endings ever inflicted on a TV show in modern television history. Seriously, this could outbad Game of Thrones. Almost. But first of all, how did we get here? If you've never seen Supernatural before, I'm not sure why you're watching this video, but it's possible you've seen it on TV, or are generally aware of it from aforementioned fandom spaces, or just know it culturally. But even if you've never watched it, that doesn't mean you really know it. And by it, I mean the crazy rabid fan base and the shipping that sprung up around it at the height of its popularity. You see, the premise of the show, the original premise, that makes up seasons 1 to 3, is that it's a ghost hunting series following 2 brothers, Sam and Dean Winchester, and a 1967 Chevy Impala. The brothers drive from place to place in small-town America, chasing and killing all manner of supernatural creatures preying on humanity, and in the process also looking for their missing dad. It's good episodic horror. largely driven by the bonds of family and the characters doing good deeds by shooting, beheading, and occasionally torturing supernatural beings. It's a fun show. Solid premise, pretty good execution that quickly built up a fan base invested in the world and characters. Unfortunately, the writers forgot to include the one thing that could keep such a fandom in check. Female characters. Or, really, any non-related characters to speak of. You see, when you have dedicated online fans, those fans have a thing scientifically known as shipping energy that's generated by the millions of teenage girls itching to write fanfiction and draw fan art of your show. And that energy needs to go somewhere. That somewhere can be your lead opposite sex characters who spend most of the show hating each other, or it can be two blokes who the fandom find vaguely attractive who made eye contact that one time. But if a suitable pairing doesn't exist, don't worry, your fans will find an unsuitable one. And if those characters just happen to be brothers, yeah, that's not gonna stop them. And yes, the ship was called Wincest, as in Winchester incest. Supernatural did have other minor characters, but they only ever appeared for a few episodes. Most of them were either one-dimensional villains who died within 30 minutes of appearing, or were their dad, which I guess would have been worse than two brothers banging, so at least the fandom didn't stoop that low. On the other hand, you had two attractive brothers, and every other episode's theme is about how important they are to each other, and praising the values of brotherly love. What were people supposed to do? But in all seriousness, the female characters were badly written, and the other male characters didn't really stick around for much more than an episode, and the online fandom was made up in no small part by horny teenagers who were already shipping male-male pairings in other media, and they had a large subculture built around it. For Supernatural to fit in, shipping had to happen, and the writers had only left one good option. Well, not a good option, but an option. Now, the guy confessing his love in this scene is not Sam or Dean, the two brothers. This is Castiel. He pulls Dean out of hell, saving him from an eternity of torturing people or being tortured. And, unintentionally, saving the fandom from the ickiness of writing about two siblings having sex. Because if you think it's really weird that one of the most popular ships at the time in any fandom was Wincest, then you're not alone. There were plenty of Supernatural fans who felt that way and never shipped them. And there were even more who shipped them half-heartedly because they were there, but they didn't really like it. But their prayers were about to be answered, by a literal angel in fact, because in season 4, this happened.
Who are you?
Castiel.
Yeah, I figured that much. I mean, what are you?
I'm an angel of the Lord.
And why would an angel rescue me from hell?
Good things do happen, Dean.
Not in my experience.
What's the matter? You don't think you deserve to be saved?
Now, I don't know if you know much about fandom and shipping, but that is like crack cocaine to fangirls. Season 4 introduced the first truly shippable character, Castiel, the angel who pulls Dean out of hell on Heaven's orders, supposedly to prevent Lucifer from being freed, but when he finds out that Heaven actually wants to release Lucifer from his cage, he defies his angelic order and joins Sam and Dean's side. And in him, you have everything fans want. A regular, recurring character who doesn't constantly die, has his own agency and plots, and has a complex, morally driven subplot. There are other things that make him appealing. He's attractive, he's a bit out of touch with human society, he defies his upbringing and his family to side with the character that he's shipped with, and there's an instant bond between those two characters. I can go on. The point is that all that shipping energy that was building and building finally had a non-incestuous outlet, and the pairing exploded. It's hard to judge when Supernatural's heyday really was, because it's always had quite modest viewership numbers in America. It was popular for sure, fan conventions prove that, and it sold well overseas, but the measurement of how truly widespread a show it was seen much more online. gifts infested Tumblr like rats, fanfictions were being churned out, cons were full of supernatural cosplayers and fans wanting to buy merch, and the merch was plentiful and sold well, both in person and online. The stars Jared Padalecki and Jensen Ackles often talked about the contrast between doing supernatural and returning to the industry. At cons, they were treated like superstars, with thousands of fans turning out to hear them speak and get their photos taken. Meanwhile, on broadcast television, the show was pulling in just 2 to 3 million viewers an episode, and no network execs really knew about it. Even after its 10th season, where it cemented its status as a long-running cult classic, it was still that tiny show from the CW. Hardly worth paying attention to. This is where the issue started, on multiple fronts. The show pulled in poor numbers, but it was a fan favorite, and the CW was a tiny network. Any other show would have been cancelled the moment it didn't hit 4 million, but it was the CW's third highest rated show and a personal favourite of the network presidents. It was safe from the chopping block, but the only thing that kept it so was the goodwill of its fans, and its fans were very vocal about what they wanted to see. Actually, I should rephrase that. I'm sure there were a lot of fans who liked it outside of fandom, middle-aged men who tuned into it every week, or kids who stayed up to watch it. There were a fair few of these people at conventions as well, but the majority of the fans were the ones who engaged with the show via internet fandom, which meant that they also watched the show for an hour each week, 20 weeks of the year, but they put in hundreds of extra hours each month, making and engaging with online content centered around the show. And the creators knew it. There were entire subplots in the show dedicated to referencing their online fandom. In Season 5, the writers introduced Chuck, apparently a prophet, writing about the lives of the Winchester brothers and turning his prophecies into bargain bin paperback novels. But there's a fandom out there invested in these books, characterized by Becky, a superfan, who spends all her time writing fan fiction about its two main characters. They even give a nod to the Winchester shippers by mentioning that people ship Sam and Dean, much to the real Sam and Dean's horror.
There's Sam girls and Dean girls, and what's a slash fan?
As in Sam/Dean. Together.
That's just sick.
As a show, Supernatural is simultaneously very good and very bad at pandering to its audience. Perhaps the most obvious way is how they treated fan-favorite characters. Lucifer, Crowley, Bobby, all characters written to be in one episode or season, but were so beloved by viewers that they were written in for several subsequent series. Loki was a Norse god, killed by the Winchesters in Season 2, brought back for a cameo in Season 3, only to show back up as the Archangel Gabriel in Season 5 and beyond. Certainly something the writers had never intended for their one-off character. But while they mostly kept Gabriel contained, as beloved as he was, and he was, he only appeared in a few seasons beyond his original appearance. There was a lot of pandering that wasn't so well thought out. And here is how we get to the queerbaiting. So, here's the problem. You're a writer for a cult classic television show, but the people who make it popular, your primarily female online fans, really want your two main characters to be gay for each other. They've made this pretty clear. People are asking about it at cons, setting the main actors gay and sometimes explicit fanfictions of their characters dating and or sleeping with each other, and there's a general feeling in a number of online fandoms, not just this one, that there are not enough minority characters on television. In this instance, queer characters. You've sort of created this problem for yourself as you forgot to write any decent female characters in your early seasons, but it's too late to fix that, as fans would now be upset if you gave your main male character a female love interest, and your fans are the only things keeping the lights on. But at the same time, you can't just make 2 of your 3 main characters gay. You're a primetime horror TV series. In fact, you're a little surprised you've got any female fans at all. This show was definitely not aimed at them. Shouldn't they be watching Sex and the City or something? And you've got plenty of normal male viewers who tune in for your show. They were the original target demographic, and they'd be totally put off by having a gay couple as the main romance. Besides, you've been on TV for 4 years now, and you haven't managed to write a healthy relationship yet. What would you even do once you got them together? It's a nightmare seesaw. You can't make them gay, that would be absurd. But also, you sort of need to make them gay so that your viewers don't stop watching. Enter this weird balancing act of making them gay enough to appease your online fandom, while making them not gay enough that casual viewers notice. And so Supernatural invented queerbaiting. It didn't actually invent the term per se. Queerbaiting was coined as it's used today in the 1990s, but it didn't pick up traction until the early 2010s, with Supernatural leading the charge. Supernatural really wrote the textbook on how to cultivate appeal and publicity by queerbaiting your fans. A textbook that the show Teen Wolf would recite page for page a few years later. The techniques the writers used to hint at a possible gay relationship are notable in the show, encouraging moments of closeness between your two shippable characters, hinting that other characters could see them as a couple, jokes about them having a relationship or having sex.
Sorry, you have me confused with the other angel? You know, the one in the dirty trench coat who's in love with you?
Plot points where characters have to put them above other people or their own goals. All this happens in abundance. But where Supernatural really excelled was through fan interactions, both on social media and via conventions. Fans invested in the relationship between Dean and Castiel, or Castiel as it's known, also consumed a lot of media made from Q&As, panels, and tweets. And they were particularly egged on by the behaviour of Misha Collins, who played Castiel. I would like to think that Misha Collins is just a good guy who likes his fans and wants to support them in their interpretation of his character, and encourage them to interact with him in the way that they enjoy. It sort of seems that might be the case, at least at first. While he was the actor pushing Castiel the hardest, he was also raising money for charity, and he seemed pretty in favour of the idea of queer representation, and he was generally pretty supportive of queer fans. However, his behaviour at cons and on Twitter, making statements with implied support for Castiel, being very touchy-feely with Dean's actor Jensen Ackles, despite Jensen Ackles' dislike for the ship, hinting that the relationship might eventually come to fruition, all caused some raised eyebrows. And people have since questioned his motives for pushing the Castiel could be canon narrative. It definitely bolstered his own fame and audience, and there have been accusations thrown around that the Castiel merch he promotes for charity give him a sizable cut. He's certainly one of the Castiel fans in the early days who saw him as their voice on set, and took it as a huge victory that one of the actors supported their ship. I don't think the actors were encouraged or instructed to do this by the network, although when copying their handbook, this was something that Teen Wolf execs would do years later, instructing their actors to play into fan delusions about the ship's steric, which led to a lot of harassment of young actors from fans. Certainly, if the actors were told to play along with Castiel's shippers, Jensen Ackles refused to play ball. Although he didn't often say it specifically, he made it clear that he objected to the pairing enough times that fans took note. But Misha Collins' actions, in combination with how the writers treated the pairing, does leave a bitter taste in my mouth. And fans weren't just being crazy. Okay, there was some crazy behaviour that I won't excuse, like sending actors unsolicited fanfictions and fanarts of their characters, and harassing Jensen Ackles about Castiel to the point where he started lashing out at fans. But from an actual story perspective, they had some weight. They wanted to see queer representation. The show obliged much later, including a one-off episode with a gay hunter couple, and reoccurring lesbian minor character Charlie, who manages to go a record-breaking 3 seasons before dying. For the first time, anyway. But their efforts paled in comparison to the sort of representation people were asking for with Castiel. Fans might have started shipping Castiel and Dean just because they were there and, well, not related. But there is something genuinely compelling beneath the surface of their relationship. Castiel did save Dean from hell, where he had started torturing other souls in order not to be tortured himself. Dean convinced Castiel to turn against a corrupt heaven, forfeiting the support of his entire race, and later his angelic abilities, in order to side with this man who turned his entire worldview upside down. And whether or not you think it's contrived, an angel of the Lord pulling a man from hell who he later falls in love with, forcing him to turn against a disapproving and malicious heaven, is a hell of a queer narrative to pull off. And it's no less trailblazing from Dean's side. Sure, modern TV has coming out narratives for days, but not many include the story of a man coming to terms with his bisexuality in his late 30s. And the ones that do certainly aren't genre shows. At the time, Castiel would have been genuinely pioneering, and I don't think it's a coincidence that fellow cult classic Hannibal would take the same path several years later to audience acclaim. Also at this time, Supernatural entered a period of stagnation. Their love for bringing back fan favourites, while appreciated by fans of those characters, was biting them in the arse narrative-wise, given that a character couldn't seem to stay alive for more than 40 minutes. The fan favourites that continued to show up had often been killed in their last appearance, and Sam, Dean, and later Cass had died and or been sent to hell, or an equivalent, several times. Death wasn't so much a permanent thing anymore, unless the writers decreed it, which had the double issue of death being incredibly arbitrary. No one was really dead, unless they were, and also not very effective anymore as a plot device. Once you've come back to life 3 or 4 times, your death scenes stop being emotional points of the show and start being a thing your audience has to slog through until your next reincarnation. Supernatural also had a huge issue with power creep. This in itself didn't stagnate the narrative, but the way it was handled meant that each season, every villain was pretty much the same as the last one, except more powerful and harder to kill. Until they were inevitably defeated, of course, in the season finale, along with one major or minor character death, who was definitely going to come back to life in the opener of the next season. The series' climaxes weren't the only thing that lacked variety. The showrunners saw Supernatural as a story that, at its heart, was about 2 brothers, meaning to them, other characters, even major ones like Castiel, ducked in and out of the narrative for sometimes arbitrary seeming reasons, and the major relationship was still between Sam and Dean. And while I don't think it's incorrect that Sam and Dean are the heart of the show, the writers had accidentally stumbled onto another avenue of audience appeal, the found family trope. Characters like Bobby, and later Cass and Charlie and Jack, were not popular and beloved just because they were good characters, but because fans loved the variety of relationships that our main characters had with them, and they hungered for more of that. But while the writers had created it accidentally, they didn't capitalize on it as much as they could have. At least, not in the mid-seasons between series 5 and 10. What the audience was left with was a number of Monster of the Week episodes that were Sam and Dean-centric, focusing on the issues between the 2 brothers. But after 5 or 6 seasons, those episodes were largely the same issues they'd been having since season 1. The dynamic was old and boring. This is a huge part of the reason fans were so vocal about wanting their ship to be canon. Sexuality was a brand new issue that the show hadn't really touched on before, and it could easily have eaten up a whole season of drama if they'd written it right. Sure, there were other things the writers could have done to freshen up the plots, but they didn't, and the fans knew it. So why weren't they doing this? Especially when they were so reluctant to take it off the table. So anyway, this goes on for about 10 more years. A lot of people start jumping ship about 3 years in, and from season 8 onwards the show starts hemorrhaging fans who've lost faith that the writing will improve and are sick of seeing the same stories play out over and over again every episode and every season. The ones that remain are still pretty invested in Castiel, but without that huge fanbase behind them, they're no longer making a large stink, getting trending hashtags, winning People's Choice competitions, and signing petitions to the writers, and all that nonsense. You still have to keep your remaining fans on side, but these are the ones that stayed. They seem pretty happy with whatever crumbs you keep throwing at them. Your fandom is dying down, but the cult still exists, and your viewership numbers have miraculously stayed the same. The Heaven vs. Hell plotline that you started in season 4 has left huge unanswered questions hanging over your show, like where is God for all this? But it's okay, your fans have come up with a better answer than you ever could have. Remember that prophet that novelized the Winchesters' lives so you could make fun of Wincest shipping? Well, turns out the fans really like him, and they think he should be God. And your fans are the ones paying the bills, so you'd better not annoy them. So he's God now, except he's not a good God, and the main characters are gonna have to kill him at some point. But you've got all the time in the world, so you keep treading over the same story arcs, just replacing it with different seasonal villains each time. You'll get there when you get there. And eventually you do. You start wrapping things up about season 13, and by the time season 15 rolls around, you're ready for your final showdown against God. That's probably for the best. There's been no sharp drops, but the numbers are steadily decreasing, and season 15 sees your first episode hit below 1 million views. The rest are much higher. And for some goddamn reason, you decide that this will be the last scene of a character you've been developing for over a decade.
I love you.
So this scene trends on Twitter. There are a lot of people on there, and on other sites, including Tumblr, which is still running strong as a fandom base, who used to watch the show, or at the very least remember the big deal that fans made about Supernatural and Castiel. For those that aren't familiar, it doesn't take long to fill them in. People have been shipping this pairing for over 10 years, and tonight, 2 episodes from the final, they made it canon. Castiel is officially in-game. Except no, it isn't, because of course Supernatural half-assed this. Of course they did it in the worst possible way. Your fans wanted a sensitive exploration of sexuality and a romantic payoff for a slow build romance, and instead they got a teary confession that is totally unprecedented from one actor, while the other stands there looking like he just had a watermelon shoved up his ass. Instead of having a moment of realization and a process of understanding and coming to terms with their feelings for each other, The angel Castiel declares his love for another man, saying that this declaration of his unrequited feelings is his moment of true happiness that will drag him backwards into some sort of super hell. His gay love literally sends him to hell in the most homophobic and unsatisfying reveal ever. The irony is not lost on your former fans, or anyone who remembers the queerbaiting scandals, who immediately ridicule the storyline as a payoff for the fans who shipped them. It's very much a monkey claw situation where they got what they wanted in absolutely the worst way possible, to the point where it would have been better if it hadn't have happened at all. The ridicule goes viral, trending above both Putin's resignation and the US election coverage. I can only assume that this was a little bit the point. Make one half of the most shipped couples in fandom history declare his love for the other half, and leave it a little open-ended so that it could possibly be wrapped up in the season finale that you want everyone to tune into. I'll admit, it sort of worked on me. I'd been planning to tune into the finale anyway, for nostalgia. I wasn't excited by the gay revelation in the way the writers probably thought I would be as a former fan, but the fun of basically laughing at how bad the show was made me want to get context for the final season that I'd previously been happy to miss. Everything about the confession scene was hilarious to me, from the contrasting emotions of the actors to how badly the writers missed their mark yet again, to the comedic timing that the news broke in the middle of the US election cycle and how the internet just ran with it, making meme after meme after meme. It was funny because it was so wonderfully, terribly bad. So, I watched the entire 15th season of Supernatural. I kinda thought it might shed some light on the love scene confession, plant some seeds, drop some hints, but in true Supernatural fashion, it absolutely did not, which just makes it funnier. I can't imagine being one of those viewers who tune in to watch it on TV, totally oblivious to the shipping that happens online, and seeing that confession. It comes out of nowhere. And that's not to say it's not explicit. I can't imagine a correct interpretation of that scene that can dismiss Castiel saying the one thing he wants he knows he can't have, and telling Dean that he loves him as a moment of true happiness, especially when he's expressed familial and platonic love to Dean in the past. But I don't know what the average viewer is supposed to make of that scene. There was no foreshadowing. There were no prior hints. Castiel was treating Dean exactly the same as he had for the last 10 years, if anything, keeping him more at arm's length. And then bam! Love confession. I could not imagine a more jarring scene to see in a television show. Unless, of course, you're aware of the shipping that's been happening online. But outside the lack of context for that entire disaster, the season was genuinely enjoyable. The series opener, as usual, continuing from a massively overpowered and over-dramatized season finale, was dorky and sort of badly written, but because I wasn't at all invested in the show, I found it funny and charming rather than frustrating and bad. The middle of the season was genuinely good. The show writers had finally started leaning into the found family dynamic with Cass's adopted son Jack, and while it did do the old Supernatural trick of killing him in the first 30 seconds, literally it happened in the flashbacks, once he got resurrected, he was a welcome addition to the dynamic, and he kept things fresh. The Monster of the Week episodes were truly the best part though. There were several good ones this season, and while some of them were a bit of a miss, the best ones reminded me of those early seasons of Supernatural that were self-contained episodes of horror, comedy, or mystery, police procedural type stories. Because, at its heart, Supernatural is a genuinely cool concept. Repetitive storylines and bad writing aside, the idea of two brothers, guardians to humanity against all manner of dangers that lurk in the dark, doing the job because they can, because they care, is an amazing base for a show. And in season 15, there were moments where you genuinely got to see that. You saw Sam shepherding a mother and daughter to safety with a heartbreakingly gentle touch on their backs after saving them from ghosts. In one episode, Dean comforts a girl who was a victim of a werewolf attack by telling her in a tone that is eerily reminiscent of an SVU episode. No matter what you say you saw, we will believe you. Because that's what this show is about. Two men who've put aside any chance they have for a normal life so that they can help people. So that they can save people. Watching the final season and remembering how good the show was in its heyday was a bit of a double-edged sword. Because if I hadn't done that, I would have watched the finale and been like, well, thank God I got out of that when I did. Instead, I got to rekindle my genuine affection for the show right before I got it slapped out of me by the worst ending since Game of Thrones. So, Castiel's confession was pretty bad. The way it was written was half-assed, it undermined his entire character. I personally didn't believe there were ever any plans to have it reciprocated by Dean, and if they'd written that into the finale, I don't think it would have made sense for his character. The reason why fans wanted an exploration of Dean's bisexuality is partly because it's compelling drama, but partly because him having a gay relationship wouldn't really make sense without some sort of storyline about him coming to terms with his feelings. He is such a straight-coded character, very much the embodiment of typical American masculinity, and he's deliberately designed that way. So to have him suddenly reciprocate his feelings for Cass would be bordering on unrealistic and bizarre. But if you don't pay off Cass's confession, which they didn't, then you have this weird ending where Cass doesn't even make the season finale after being a major character for 11 seasons, and he gets mentioned like 3 times in the last 2 episodes, and there is no resolution there. And he doesn't even really need to be dead, because it's mentioned that Jack brings him back to life, so there is absolutely no good reason why he wouldn't see Dean either on Earth before Dean dies, or in heaven. So it's bad for Cass's character, but you also have this thing where Dean is super sad about Cass dying for about 5 seconds, and then they just have to forget about him and save the world by themselves, which they do in the most bizarre manner, by the way. The episode speeds through a full season's worth of plot, with at least 3 top 10 anime betrayals. And then at the end of the episode, Dean explains how he was tricking Chuck all along and knew everyone was working against him. Like this is some sort of murder mystery dinner, in a way that really clashes with the genre and expectations. Then they leave Chuck alive, which feels like a loose end, but is supposed to seem like justice, because Chuck doesn't want to be left alive and powerless, but whatever, they'd written themselves into a corner. I guess it was the best they could do. And it's revealed that Jack, Castiel's adopted son, has all of God's powers, and now he's going to set the world to rights. And not once does anyone say, hey, while you're at it, can you bring Cass back? He and Dan kinda had some unfinished business, and also, we really liked him. And, well, he is your dad. And this whole storyline is made weirder by the fact that this is only the second to last episode. So, what's in the final episode? The final episode has no God. It has no overarching big bad. It has no Jack. It also has no Castiel, which, as I've mentioned, weird. It takes the show back to its monster hunting roots. And it's just a typical vamp nest hunt, except during the fight, Dean gets impaled on a nail and dies. Now, I sort of like this concept, and I know I like it because, much like the Chuck is God idea, I saw this ending floating around in fandom a long time before the writers wrote that episode. Like, 10 years before. It was basically someone saying, I think the way Supernatural should end is, and their idea is that Sam and Dean should be on a normal hunt, and a fight goes wrong, and they both die, and then the episode's over. And it's fitting because hunters do die young, and they've tried to have a normal life so many times before, but it has never worked. So this is their sense of, they did what they could do, it ended how it was always going to end. No heaven, no angels, no God. Just 2 hunters doing the best they can with what they've got. And that ending is so much better than the ending we actually got. Not just because the actual ending completely left Cass at a loose end, but because the way it was written screwed the execution in every way. The ending's well and good, but Dean had just defeated God, and he dies on a rusty nail? Sam lives and names his kid Dean, which sucks for Dean, I guess. He is always the one dying for Sam, always protecting his little brother, Daddy's little soldier who got conscripted into the life. Sam got pulled out of university to look for his dad, and that's why he's a hunter, yeah, but he only got the chance to go to university because of how Dean looked after him when they were kids. Dean sacrificed so much for Sam, and he was never given a choice, not really. Every time Dean thinks about retiring, the narrative forces him right back into hunting, making him give up his hope of a normal life. So I guess that's just it. Here's your early death as a reward for saving the world 1,000,000 times over. And then he's in heaven, and you get Bobby explaining the new rules, where he casually mentions the fact that Cass is alive again, which Dean barely blinks at. And then Dean goes for a drive in his Impala, and over this is a montage of Sam living his life, although not with the love interest they set up for the last several seasons, which was a really well done relationship, by the way. She just stopped existing, apparently. And when he dies, he gets to join Dean in heaven, which is a little weird because it implies he's made 0 more pressing connections in his 40 years of life. And it's all very trite and predictable and takes about half an hour too long, and it pays off absolutely nothing, and doesn't wrap up the series. The one thing you can say about the episode is that Jensen Ackles was acting his heart out, almost too much, because he plays Dean really happy in the early parts of the episode, and it feels like one of those early comedy episodes that they used to have where something supernatural happens, but there's a comedic slant and everything and nothing's taken too seriously. And those were great episodes, don't get me wrong, but it's a little weird to have that feeling when Dean dies 5 minutes later. And that was the end of 15 years of television, rounded off in an almost slapstick way, in a weird 2-episode format that did justice to none of the main characters or storylines. Remind you of anything? I don't know if there's a good conclusion for this video essay, other than maybe, if you stop watching a show because the writing is bad, don't start watching it again just because you think it might be funny, because it won't be. It will spit in your face and laugh at you for ever caring about it. I mean, Cass got dragged backwards into turbo hell for being gay, but at least the car got into heaven. Dean car OTP forever, I guess.